to our event from the Children's Wood in association with the Ghost Institute and In Transit. We're really pleased to be here again after the event last year. My name's Steve, I'm with the Children's Wood, and today we're going to hear from a range of different organisations involved in tackling inequality under the heading of sharing spaces, creating a more equal society through placemaking. Just as a quick reminder, on the tables, and there should be a few little membership forms to sign up to the Children's Wood. That's quite important for us to show to our funders of the scale of involvement in our projects. So please do if you have the time. And I won't say too much now. What we'll do is we'll listen to the talks, which will range from income inequality through to community farming, and also our own work within the Children's Wood. And then we'll go out to the meadow and have some food and speak to some more groups, especially local groups around Glasgow, such as Meadows Food Bank. And then have a community ceilidh back here at around 4 o'clock. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bill Kerry.
I'm from the Equality Trust. We're an educational charity that campaigns to improve the quality of life in the UK by reducing economic inequality. Economic inequality is mostly to do with income inequality, although we do talk about wealth inequality as well. There's a slight difference, but I won't trouble you with that today because I've only got 20 minutes. We launched in 2009 with this book called The Spirit Level, which some of you may have heard of, read. It was a bestseller, a surprise bestseller. Books with graphs and statistics don't normally do that well, but it did. And I should warn you, there's some graphs and statistics in this talk, but not too many. So, what am I going to show you? This is just what's coming up. I'll tell you how unequal the UK is, talk about recent trends in UK inequality, and a bit about the focus on poverty. Poverty and inequality, linked but not the same thing. Then I'll talk about inequality and its mechanisms, why it causes all the problems it causes. Then I'll talk about trust and community, which are particularly relevant to the people here today, I think. And some closing thoughts about solutions and what we can all do. So how unequal is the UK? The Spirit Level looked at these rich developed countries and asked how much richer are on average are the richest 20% compared to the poorest 20%. The book also looked at the 50 US states, so it looked at 2 test beds and it found similar relationships in both. But I'm just looking at the developed countries today. The UK is over here. We're one of the most unequal countries in the developed world. About twice as unequal as the Scandinavian countries and Japan. Japan's interesting because, unlike the Scandinavian countries, which have this so-called Nordic model where they tax people a lot, redistribute it and have a comprehensive welfare state, that's how they get to their greater equality. Japan doesn't really do any of that. It just has a narrower spread of income before tax, so it has a different route to its greater equality. But anyway, the UK is not doing very well. This data was culled in the sort of early to mid 2000s, so it's a little bit out of date, but broadly, you wouldn't get a very different picture if you did that now. So, in fact, my friends from Sweden have been telling me how Sweden has been going backwards in the last 10 years, and it's probably more unequal than that graph suggests. So that's just one example. The averages obviously hide as much as they reveal. So if you go behind the average in the UK, if you go top versus bottom, the average full-time annual pay for a FTSE 100, that's Financial Times Stock Exchange listed, large company, their chief executive officers are pulling in around 4.3 million a year once you add together the pensions, the long-term incentive plans, the bonuses, and the salary, so that's 4.3 million a year. The average UK worker is, in full-time, earns around £27,000. We would call that extreme inequality, and that's a phrase that we use quite a lot. The UK suffers from extreme inequality. If you look at top versus bottom rather than top versus average, the national minimum wage is set to rise to £6.70 per hour on the 1st of October this year. That will still be worth less, over £2,000 less than a living wage. The living wage which is recommended by the Living Wage Foundation, which is something like £9.15 in London and £8 something outside of London. So the minimum wage, not great. Someone on the new minimum wage from October would need to work 333 years to earn just 1 year's average pay of a FTSE CEO. Now, I know life expectancy is going up a bit, but 333 years is a long time. So, if the minimum wage had grown since 1999 as much as chief executive pay, it would now be £12.33 an hour, as opposed to £6.70. So, pretty severe situation. How did we get here? This is something called the Gini coefficient, which is a standard measure of inequality. Economists use it. Politicians sometimes refer to it. The Gini coefficient, we were quite equal back in the mid-70s. The things got bad in the 80s, inequality shot up, and ever since then it's sort of bobbled around in this sort of high groove. So we tend to refer to it as entrenched inequality. It's gone down recently because of the recession, post-crash, which actually, that tends to compress inequality a bit, mainly because a lot of rich, very rich people become a bit less rich. But we think with the changes that have been made by the last government and probably this one, we're expecting this to tick up again soon. The political discourse over this period is interesting because inequality hasn't been mentioned much. What gets mentioned a lot is poverty, and doing something for the poorest and raising people out of poverty, and there's lots of discourse around equality of opportunity and social mobility. Not so much about whether we should restrain the top and boost low pay. Actually bearing down on inequality is rather sidelined in favour of discourses around social mobility and equality of opportunity. Why does all this matter? This is kind of the core of the book, really. The book looked at all these health and social problems, life expectancy, maths and literacy scores, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, levels of trust, obesity, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility. In the book, there's a chapter on each one of these, and there's a graph for each one of them. Luckily, the authors combined the data scores into an index, and they plotted it against income inequality. They found a really strong relationship. The more unequal you are, the more you suffer from these health and social problems. There we are, UK up there. The better performing countries are the Scandinavians, Japan, Belgium. For the Scandinavians here, you might like to know that Denmark doesn't do so well because they all smoke like chimneys, apparently. So the Danish health stats aren't great, but everything else about Denmark is great. And the countries like France and Germany, Canada, they're holding in the middle. Netherlands is holding quite well. But as I say, in the last 10 years, this picture would have changed slightly. Some countries down the bottom end will have done a bit worse. But the point is the correlation is very, very strong. Now, all these health and social problems exhibit what are known as social gradients. So the middle class suffer from these problems more than the very rich, and the poor suffer more than the middle class. So it's what we call a social gradient. As you go down the socioeconomic scale, these problems become more prevalent. All this graph is showing you is that that tendency anyway is made worse, exacerbated by inequality. Interestingly, if a country does badly on one of these, it's likely to do badly on all of them. If a country does well on one of them, it's likely to do well on all of them. These health and social problems, some of which are quite unrelated, all appear to be moving together. In epidemiology, that suggests an underlying cause, and no one's come up with a better suggestion than that. Another interesting factor about this graph is that even if the UK made a small improvement in its level of inequality, if it managed to reduce it down to, say, where France or Canada was, we would gain enormous amounts of well-being. Because the gradient is, because the graph is so steep, it just shows that even if we made small improvements in the UK, we would benefit greatly. Richard and Kate, the authors, also plotted the same index against effectively income, total income, so wealth of the economy. And interestingly, going from that nice tight correlation and that strong relationship, you go to this. If you just plot these health and social problems against per capita income, the trend line disappears, the dots fly all over the place, there's no correlation. You can be twice as rich as, say, the USA is compared to New Zealand, and have worse health and social problems. So it's almost telling you that it's not so much about growing the economic pie as how you distribute it. If you grow the economic pie, it doesn't necessarily predict that you're going to be healthier or have fewer social problems, but if you do something about inequality, you will benefit. The mechanisms that lead from inequality to these health and social problems are quite complicated, and they're rooted in physical biology. The main link that flows from inequality to these poor health and social problems is chronic stress. When human beings are stressed, their central stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, are raised. That's as it should be if you're, for example, running from a house fire or running away from a threat. That's what your stress hormones are for. What they're not for is to be permanently elevated because of having a stressful life. And that chronic stress, that sustained stress, leads to poor health, leads to bad choices, drink, drugs, risk-taking, overeating, leads to violence. If you put very stressed people into a corner, they can lash out. So that's the sort of main mechanism that the book discusses. And it can sort of be summed up in this pictorial here. And if there's one phrase that you should go away with in your head today, it's material differences create social distances. It damages the relationships between all of us. So more inequality, you have more feelings of superiority and inferiority in a society. People have more status insecurity, they worry about how they're seen and judged. There's more status competition, there's more consumerism. People buy themselves things they probably don't need to cheer themselves up. The MPs' expenses scandal was an interesting one. What did those MPs who fiddled their expenses, what did they spend the money on? Plasma screen TVs, soft furnishings, duck houses, moat cleaning. All very visible outward markers of status. So this consumerist idea really takes hold in an unequal society. People worry about how they're seen and judged. They suffer from more social evaluation anxiety. They worry about threats to self-esteem, and they worry about their social status and fear of negative judgment. Laboratory tests show that the most reliable way to raise a human being's stress response is to give them tasks where they feel like they are judged in front of other people. Nothing makes people stressed out more. Social evaluative threat. Humans are very sensitive to it. So turning towards trust and community, so moving away from the individual reaction to stress. In the UK, barely 1 in 3 of us, according to surveys, thinks that most other people can be trusted. In the more equal Scandinavian countries, it's more like 2 in 3 people think most other people can be trusted. That's a very different feel about society, 1 in 3 versus 2 in 3. People tell me when they go to Scandinavia, my friends can tell me this if this is true, but one of the first things that someone going to Scandinavia notices, particularly Sweden, is how low the walls are around people's properties. Very low walls or no walls, contrasted with the gated communities that seem to be springing up in the UK. And without greater trust, it's hard to build cohesive and supportive communities. If people don't trust each other, they're less likely to want to mix with each other. And it's without greater material equality that makes it really difficult, because people's lives and experiences become too different. It's harder to build connections and empathy, and in the absence of those connections and empathy, it's much easier for distrust, suspicion and misunderstanding to grow. And I think this is, from what I've been picking up in the conversations I've had in the last 24 hours, I think this is an issue for people who are working in this sort of placemaking and sharing spaces environment, is that you've somehow got to overcome this material difference issue, or find ways to bring people together from very different walks of life. And I guess that's the challenge, and that's the challenge that you're all rising to, brilliantly as far as I can see. But it is a challenge. So inequality changes the way people interact with each other and how they engage with society. Key findings from research include people in European countries with higher levels of inequality are less likely to help each other in an act of altruism, so just going that extra mile to help somebody. More unequal societies have lower rates of both social and civic participation, including lower engagement with political parties. Higher rates of income inequality are linked to lower levels of voter turnout. And inequality is linked to lower levels of cultural activity. Essentially, in an unequal, stressed out society, where people feel worried about how they are seen and judged, you are just less likely to have people getting outside their front doors and happily engaging in activities with other people. It's a debilitating situation to feel that people might be looking down on you or judging you, and that you're at the wrong end of the socio-economic spectrum. You just feel a bit distanced from everything. Solutions to inequality, there's no magic wand. The level of inequality and poverty that a country has is simply that which it is prepared to accept. And the UK accepts too much. It's clear action can be taken to reduce it, as it has in the past. We were more equal in the past. But it needs political will, and it needs an informed social movement, that's us, to force that political will into existence. We don't think that politicians are just going to act out of the goodness of their hearts, policymakers, civil servants, politicians. They're going to need to respond to a stimulus from people. In the UK, there's good news and bad news. Over 80% of British people think inequality is too high, and they do want it reduced. And about 70% of us think it is the government's job to tackle it. The bad news is only about 12% on the latest reading think that tackling inequality is a priority issue. They think it's important, but it's not necessarily at the top. It's vying with other issues. So there's concern, but there's not yet anger. So what can we all do about this? Well, you know, you made a great start by coming out today and finding out stuff. But with regards to the Equality Trust, you can obviously you can join us as a supporter. You can sign up to our mailing list. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can visit our website, and in particular the About Inequality section, which is where the data and the stats and the evidence is. You can join the Glasgow Equality Group, which, just have a word with Emily at the back there. Join up to their events and mailing list. And obviously just tell everyone you know about what you've heard today and spread the word. And that's what our About Inequality section looks well, it's been revamped a bit, but it's got scale and trends of inequality, drivers of inequality, impacts of inequality, attitudes, latest research, and the evidence from the spirit level. So that's me done. Thank you very much. People now ask questions. Hello.
Could you tell us a bit more about your new local council initiative?
Yeah. We've got a campaign coming up starting in July, which is going to focus on getting people to campaign with their local councils about making changes that can affect inequality and poverty at a local level. So the working title for the campaign is called Make My Council Fair, and it's tackling inequality and poverty where you live. And the idea is that we all have a council so we can all make a difference. In the UK, there's quite a drive towards localism and more regional government. So more councils are going to be taking more and more decisions that affect our lives. And we think that there's lots that councils can do, from the way it pays its own staff to the way it pays contractor staff, the way that it conducts itself as an ambassador, for example, for the living wage across its area. There's lots of things a local council can do that can make life better in terms of inequality and poverty. And we're going to direct activists, hopefully all over the country, including the Glasgow Equality Group, to get onto the council and say, can you do this? For example, one of the asks will be, will you implement a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit? Now, on the face of it, you might think, what's that got to do with inequality? Well, actually, there's a very steep social gradient in road traffic accidents. Put very crudely, richer people tend to drive more, and poorer people tend to be run over more. So it is an inequality issue. And it's behind the 20's Plenty campaign, which I think parts of Glasgow have taken up. But we're pushing that as part of the campaign as well. So it's not just all about money, but it is about addressing these inequalities. For example, we wouldn't want your council to use contracting firms that have blacklisted trade unionists, because trade unionists, trade union membership is conducive to greater equality. So all those sorts of things, we hope will get people energised about inequality and poverty in their local area.
When you've got the correlation or the change in inequality over time within the UK, then sorry, the one previous,
The genie.
yeah, this one. How does that correlate to what policies have been proposed by any political party at that point in time? So I'm wondering about how the window of kind of acceptable policy changes with time, and whether we're now in an area where the types of policy that might be suggested are not necessarily those that would support inequality, and therefore you need to kind of slow the rate of change first and then kind of...
Yeah, at the moment, none of the main political parties are suggesting anything particularly radical with regard to inequality. They're still very much stuck on the social mobility, equality of opportunity, taking the poorest and making them a little less poor. No one is talking about really restraining the top end. No one is advocating for greater trade union membership, which is one of the most effective ways of restraining inequality. So at the moment, I'm not going to lie to you, the picture doesn't look good. I don't know how bad things have to get before things turn around. Hopefully not much worse, but I don't know. I'd like to give you a message of hope and optimism, but at the moment, I just don't quite feel it, and I think that's why it's very important that people start maybe looking at making changes at a local level. Don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, but I don't think there's a simple answer.
No. I mean, to be fair, I mean, the Thatcher government in the 80s, they didn't sit down and say, let's make inequality worse. They just pursued policies that had that result. They deregulated the city in what was called Big Bang, so that took the lid off top pay. There was mass unemployment as they moved from a broadly manufacturing country to a broadly service-based economy. So that obviously didn't help the incomes of the bottom end. And there was this radical reduction in the level of trade union membership. So all those things taken together, institutional changes, if you like, laid the foundation for this soaring inequality. That's fine.
Cool, thank you. Thank you.